The topic for my paper is Deathworld: Women in the Partition of 1947. As if the atrocities inflicted by the British colonial power weren't enough, the burden of the process of decolonizing India too was left on the shoulders of millions of Indians who craved liberation. The colonizers had made them believe that their ways of living were inferior and uncivil, their desire for unity in diversity as unachievable, disregarding and declaring them incapable of governance. In a case like that of the partition, what happens when the colonizers retreat? The oppressors may have left, however, the trauma caused by racial violence remains, embedded into the socio-political systems left behind. And even if these systems were to be rewritten and restructured, the deep seated trauma in the minds of the ones colonized continues to haunt them for generations. Just like the colonial occupation of the British Raj wrote new spatial relations, the decolonization of this occupation also produced new boundaries, hierarchies, and zones. These boundaries created divisions in space and society, marking the partition of 1947 the creation of two independent nations, India and Pakistan, with blood. This paper looks at the creation of a death world during this event, where biopower was abused and necropolitics was employed to use women and their bodies as weapons for destruction. According to the diplomat, quote, 15 million individuals were driven out of their homes and as many as 3 million killed in rioting that went out of control, end quote. Was the death world a product of the partition? No, because death worlds don't simply materialize. They take roots, grow over time. A death world materializes in scattered parts that appear to be disconnected from each other until suddenly the panic for survival grips everyone in the sphere. The death world of the partition resembled the social hierarchies of India pre independence. But by nature, a death world exists outside of life and death. The devices for discrimination multiplied and enforced, power abused, people that bore the brunt of the attack suffocated and kept barely alive. The basic rights of the poor belonging to lower economic and social strata were taken away, reducing them and their existence to bare minimum. The people at the bottom of the patriarchal system crippled by the toxicity and enormity of this death world. As Membe says, these imaginaries gave meaning to the enactment of differential right to differing categories of people for different purposes within the same space. In brief, the exercise of sovereignty. Partition was reasoned on the grounds of religious differences. Communities that coexisted for millennia were uprooted, and as a result, they attacked each other. The reflection of the colonial need for classification and hierarchy is not a mere coincidence. The partition questioned the belongingness of millions of Muslims who had lived in India for generations, millions of Hindus who had been living in the region of present day Pakistan. When a question like this is raised, all your basic rights are threatened. Your existence itself is under attack. You suddenly become the other, or what Membe calls seizure between the ones and the others, is the only visible thing. As your social eligibility is lost, whatever atrocities that you're put through, including death, are reasoned based on the logics that govern the politics of the death world. Hence, the time during the partition was an undisputed struggle, but also an exercise of sovereignty in the state of exception that followed the declaration of partition. India's newly formed sovereignty was taking forms of all kinds. Bataille's idea is quoted by Membe as follows: by treating sovereignty as the violation of prohibitions, Bataille reopens the question of the limits of the political. Their alienation here became, quote, the condition for the acceptability of putting to death, the humanity of the people reduced to less than. Women were among the worst affected. Melody Razak writes on the Literary Hub in reference to her novel Moth, a historical fiction that looks at stories of women in India during partition. She says, a quote, approximately 75,000 women raped and abducted, by the millions killed and by the millions more who walked across the subcontinent in search of new homes. Women's bodies were weaponized by men for spreading violence. The female body was turned into a container of value and power belonging to the enemy that can be hence destroyed mentally and physically in order to destroy the enemy. To add to this inhumanity, It was also the duty of the men to protect the said container that belonged to them from the attacks of the enemy. So much so that women were expected to rather die salvaging their bodies from such attacks than live by bringing dishonor to their families. Here, she was not free to live her own life, nor was she free to choose her own death. Nisit Hajari in Midnight Furies writes, quote, gangs of killers set whole villages aflame, hacking to death men and children and the aged while carrying off young women to be raped. Some British soldiers and journalists who had witnessed the Nazi death camps claimed partition's brutalities were worse. Pregnant women had their breasts cut off and babies hacked out of their bellies. Infants were found literally roasted on spits. End quote. Death loomed over people who did not belong. It wasn't chosen by them. They didn't know when, where, and how it would come. But they knew that when it did, they would be stripped of all their power and ultimately stripped of life. Its contraction is relevant to the slave condition of death in life, as Membe mentions a triple loss, a loss of home, loss of rights over her body, and loss of political status. Millions of women died cruel deaths, and the ones that survived were left in the state of injury. Trains in India remain one of the important symbols of destruction of life during the partition, as they were the primary means of escape for the others to the new country. They, however, also were traps that brought in corpses that were burnt down and looted, a means for perpetrators of violence to entrap their targets who had already suffered being uprooted from their land and have their family members killed and were not even allowed to flee or to live. The trains were being means of escape were also used as technology of murder. As Manto expresses in Manto's mutterings, theorizing insanity for sanity, he says, the pity of the partition was not that instead of one country, there were now two independent India and independent Pakistan, but the fact that human beings in both countries were slaves, slaves of bigotry, slaves of religious passions, slaves of animal instincts and barbarity. The horrors left behind by the death world of the partition period was not the end or the beginning of decolonizing India. Its scars are still carried by the millions of people who survived, and especially women who carry them silently as they fear retribution for crimes they did not even commit. Thank you.